he asked me, he says, look, these guys are wanting to do a Conan comic, and would you like to write it? I said, I think they're interested. And I said, yeah, I'd like to do that. And so then immediately, it was, an original comic. So immediately I pissed all the Robert E. Howard fans off by ignoring whatever Robert E. Howard had done, other than knowing the basic aspect of the character. I mean, I'm really well versed in it. I know it. I read it. I grew up on it and stuff. But I said, Robert E. Howard's already done it. Why would I want to imitate Robert E. Howard? That seems embarrassing to Robert E. Howard's legend. If I were adapting, that might be a little different. But anyway, I did that, and that led to another collaboration. And I remember Scott Alley really, he wrote me, he said, I think that all the fans are devouring their young. They're really liking this. And so the Robert E. Howard people were in this camp, and then everybody else that hadn't read Howard were like, oh my God, this is incredible. So that was our collaboration. But Tim, and I said this earlier on the other panel, if anybody wasn't here, is one of those artists that to me, I think he's the greatest comic book artist I've ever seen, because when I can pick his stuff up, one panel moves from the other without, almost like a moving picture to me. And it doesn't, I've worked with great artists whose individual panels were just outstanding, but they didn't have that sense of movement. It had a sense of a series of beautiful portraits. And what Tim does is he actually tells the story with the art. And everybody says, well, of course that's what he's doing. But if you read comics enough, you'll know that that doesn't happen as often as you think it might. And so, and using that as a jumping off point, I wanted to ask Tim, and I know some of the answers here, but I'm going to ask him anyway, how you got into comics, how you got started, and what led you to that choice.
Well, my cousins had comic book collections when I was little, and I'm 98th percentile ADHD, so people did not want to leave me without something to do when I was a kid, because I'd tear stuff up pretty easy. And but if they sat me down in a room with a stack of comics, they knew I'd be there for 2 hours, and they wouldn't have to worry about me. And so my cousins would have all these comics, and I'd read them. And on my first day of first grade, I didn't go to kindergarten, and I was used to staying at home and drawing and reading and tearing stuff up. And Dad walked me to school, and this was just like, I had no concept. For all I knew, I was marching into hell, or I might be marching into heaven, but I wanted to know what to expect. So I was crying my eyes out as we were walking along, little 6-year-old boy. And we passed by this barber shop, and there was a stack of comics in the window, because, barbers used to be kind enough to put comics in the barber shop for the kids to read. And and I just stopped dead and looked in the window, and there was a copy of Our Fighting Forces with Gunner and Sarge. It was these two Pacific War guys who went around with this white German Shepherd. And so it combined war comics and a dog, and I thought that was pretty interesting. And I just stared at that comic, and Dad pulled me along, and I went to school. I just absolutely hated it, the structured environment, And but when I got home, Dad, on his way back, had stopped at that barber shop and had talked that barber out of that Our Fighting Forces comic, and he had it waiting for me when I got home. So it immediately cheered me up. So, but after that, it's just being exposed to my cousin's comic book collections. Then later on, I don't know if any of you are going to be here at the banquet tonight, but sort of a prelude to it is we lived in this little town called Lockwood, West Virginia, and the next big town over was Summersville, and that's where we go to get our groceries and get our haircuts and stuff. And there was this drugstore there, Nicholas Pharmacy, and they had this big rack full of comics. And Mom and Dad would give me $1 and let me off at the drugstore, and they knew that they could shop for 2 hours, and when they came back, I'd be either in front of the rack looking at comics, or else I'd be sitting at the soda fountain reading comics, the 8 comics that $1 would buy you back in those days. And so that's kind of where I discovered Robert E. Howard stuff. But it was, I just had this passion. I wanted to be a comic book artist, and I wanted to write comic books, or I wanted to be a writer of some sort. and I never knew how to go about it until I went to the Joe Kubert School in New Jersey when I was 20 years old. But and then kind of got off on my career after I graduated.
Well, tell us a little bit about the Joe Kubert School.
Well, it's a real interesting place. Joe Kubert, for anybody who doesn't know the man, he's sort of a comics industry legend. He did the Sergeant Rock comics. He did Tarzan. He worked on every imaginable superhero and war comic that was published, especially by DC. And when he was 12 years old, there was this fellow named Harry Chesler, and back in the 40s, comics were so big it was nothing for a comic to sell 2 million copies. In fact, if it would go under 1 million, they would figure out it's not worth reprinting that title. People were just devouring comic books, and so at the time, a lot of people like Harry Chesler would set up these studios. They call them shops, where they get a bunch of artists and writers together, and they'd create characters, and they'd sell them to the comic book companies. And so Joe started out in Harry Chesler's shop when he was 12, and he remembered that experience, the fact that that's how he learned comics and learned how to draw, was watching all these old pros when he was 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 years old, actually sitting down and drawing all day. So he wanted to establish a comic school, and he wanted to establish it with that principle, that there would be established pros who were teaching you the craft, not I apologize to any university professors that might be in the audience, but he didn't want somebody who had graduated from school and then had started teaching. He wanted somebody that had actual practical experience. And so I went to the Kubert School for 3 years and got taught the craft by industry legends. And also met my best friends there were Tom Yates, Steve Bissett, John Toddleman, Rick Veitch, all these guys who would go on to sort of reshape the industry and make it the sort of adult medium that we think of it today. But it was in this old mansion with a swimming pool out back. In the summer, we could go swimming in the pool, and there would always be like tadpoles and frogs swimming along with us. It wasn't very well maintained, but we didn't care. I was used to creeks growing up in West Virginia, so no big deal, all right? But anyway, that's...
Well, yeah, and the other thing that I wanted to ask that's kind of a spin-off of that is that when you were growing up, and obviously your dad furnished you with that comic and was supportive in that way, but like a lot of people that do these kind of crafts, and I think we have to take Robert E. Howard into this equation, who lived in a small town where people thought he was nuts in a way, or thought, why are you doing this strange bit of work? No matter that he was making more money probably than anybody but the banker in this town at that time. Why would you do that? I mean, what kind of, did you get a lot of support? Was there a teacher? How did your family relate to this? Is it that classic story of so many of us where, my parents understood it, but nobody else did. And I wanted to know what your experiences were there.
My parents enjoyed the fact that I was drawing. They encouraged it in the fact that Mom would save all of her, the brown paper bags you get at the grocery store. She would cut them up for me, like go along one edge, go along the other edge, and it opened up into a great big sheet of paper, and I would sit with about 10 of those after a shopping trip and be drawing all day. And she realized that I had that spark in me and that I enjoyed doing it. And I was drawing some interesting pictures, and that I did it for as long as anyone could remember. My sisters and Mom both say that as soon as I could pick up a pencil, that's when I started drawing. And and they would give me, they'd let me draw in church. So my dad was a Baptist minister, so when I heard his sermons every week, until I was 18. And I don't know, there was just so many times I could sit through the story of Job, and and it was hard. I would squirm all over the seats. Like I say, I'm intensely ADHD, but they'd give me some, something to draw on, and I'd be fine. So, but they wondered why I was drawing pictures of race cars and mythological characters instead of drawing Jesus. That kind of bothered them. And they had, coming from a labor class sort of background, they had no concept that people could actually make a living doing that. Not only that, they didn't know how they could steer me in the direction where I could make that my living. All they were interested in is that when I grew up, I'd be able to make a living out of it. And none of us had the concept about how to do that. But later on, when I got into grade school, I had a couple of teachers that would, in fact, I just sort of realized this in the last year, but I was telling my wife about it. There was one teacher who, one assignment she had us to do was to take 15 poems and copy the poems down and then write a picture to go along with the poem. And so we had these little books of these poems with our illustrations in them. And that sort of got me into the concept of seeing material and interpreting it. And then the same teacher would take these, Disney used to make these long playing albums that would have like, Lady and the Tramp or whatever. And it would tell the story of those movies. And she would play those and have us to draw while we were listening to the music and to draw portions of the story. And it was another thing that sort of reinforced this, interpreting what you were hearing. Because I hadn't seen any of the movies. It's not that I wasn't allowed to, we didn't go to many of the Disney animated films. And so anyway, that kind of reinforced that. And then later on in high school, I had this great instructor, Glenn Toller, who was a former Marine, and he would take us out on these mountain climbing expeditions and stuff like that he would probably have gotten sued for in this day and age. But anyway, he was just really instrumental in making me see that, yeah, you can make a living out of this stuff. There's people that actually make a living out of this. I didn't know the exact avenue yet, and I wouldn't until I went to the Hubert School. But anyway, those were sort of that's a general.
I want to ask you something else, but when I was growing up too, I mean, that was, my parents were encouraging, but they always had that thing, you needed something to fall back on.
Yeah.
And so I was supposed to get a degree, which never happened because I started selling stuff after I'd been going a while. But I remember how I felt when I had my first sale, and so what I want to ask you is what was the first thing, your first assignment, and what did you do? What was it that happened?
The first assignment I got paid for was right after I met my wife Beth at West Virginia University. I was 19 years old, and I just started drawing again. I'd flunked out of 2 art schools, and just because I was being taught art education and then just general art stuff. I wanted to illustrate and do comics. And I just felt very unfulfilled with the classes I was taking. So I actually quit drawing, and we went to I guess I stopped drawing for about a year, but we went to a comic book convention, first comic book convention in West Virginia at West Virginia University. And Val Mayerick was going to be there, and Don McGregor. Don McGregor was one of my champions because he had done Masters of Kung Fu, Deadly Hands of Kung Fu. And I loved that comic, and I loved his writing. And so I said, I'm going to draw some stuff for the convention just to show to them, see what they think. And they were real supportive. I showed it to them, and they were really encouraging me to do that. Next year, Stan Lee was the guest, and I did the same thing. And I showed my work at Stan Lee, and he said, I want you to send some stuff up to Marvel, And so I was like, wow, this is kind of cool. But as a result of that, somebody had seen me give my stuff to Stan Lee, worked at West Virginia, what do they call it? WVNet. It was the first computer network in West Virginia, at West Virginia University. The building was about as big as this building, and it had those old, the computers that had the spools running, and the walls were just lined with those things. And there were these big boxes sitting in the middle of the rooms that, more computer stuff. And there was probably about, like 500 megabytes of memory in this room, this entire building. And but that was the computer network. It was state of the art at that time. And they did this they did an annual report, and they wanted to have a different slant on the annual report, so they had me to do these fantasy characters, and it was like little elves and gnomes and stuff with these big spools of tape, and so that's my first professional job. I think I got like $150 for that.
Yeah.
But yeah.
How did that lead to your first comic job?
Well, actually going to the Joe Kubert School led to my first comic job. I was the only married student in the school at the time. And Beth and I were, my wife, we needed to bring in a little income. So during the second year of school, there was a Creative Computing magazine was published in Morristown, New Jersey. And I said, I'm going to go there and see if they want to do a comic in Creative Computing magazine. I have the portfolio for it, 10 drawings from the WVNet. And sure enough, I went in there and I came out with a job. They had me to do this 2-page comic. I did it in 2 issues of the magazine. And got about $50 for each of the installments. And Joe severely frowned on my getting a job before I had graduated. But hey, we needed the money.
Yeah, got to eat.
And then the week before I graduated from the school, I sent out portfolios to like 10 different role-playing game companies because they were doing this neat stuff, fantasy-oriented stuff. And I got a call back from one of them in SPI Games in New York City. And that was really my first postgraduate degree job, was doing a bunch of stuff for SPI Publishing, and which in turn led me to working at TSR, because TSR bought SPI. A lot of the old editors I worked with there went to TSR Hobbies in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, and so they moved me up to Wisconsin. But that was my first stories were actually for role-playing game things.
Okay.
That's how I began.
I'd forgotten that. You told me that before. Well, how did that lead into what we call mainstream comics?
I was working at TSR, and it was in Lake Geneva, and Lake Geneva is an hour and a half drive from Chicago. And in Chicago, every Sunday they used to have these, not every Sunday, it was first Sunday of every month, they'd have these one-day comic book conventions in Chicago. And somebody told me there was going to be this new comic book publishing company there, First Comics.
Yeah.
And so I had an incredible portfolio at that point because I've been doing role-playing games for about 2 years. And I had a real different slant to my artwork. No one had seen anything like it. Like all the other guys, when we go to these conventions, gaming conventions, guys would come up to the other artists who were like oil moguls or cattlemen or big businessmen and having to do these, $10,000 commissions and stuff. And I attracted the bikers, the hippies, the musicians, the guy, and so there was just something about my art that kind of fit that seedier mold. So anyway, I took my portfolio to that little convention, and I met the people at First, and they were like looking at my stuff, we got a project you might be interested in. We'll give you a call next week. So I said, great. And they seemed to be pretty tickled, and I felt pretty good about myself, And so I was working at TSR. One number that I had given them was my work number. And the art director came in and he said, Tim, you got a phone call. And somebody's on my phone. Could you come into my office and get it? And I was like, yeah. So I went into his office, and it was them offering me a job, doing comics. So I had to sort of negotiate this quick rendezvous at the First offices in Evanston, Illinois, right there in my art director's office. But I didn't mind because I was wanting out of there desperately. So anyway, that's kind of how it started. I started doing the thing Grimjack as a backup feature, and it got pretty popular. And
yeah. Well,
I was
you
able
know,
to quit.
one of the things that I've noticed, and I don't mean every generation does this, back in the old days, but what I do notice is a lot of the people that I deal with, primarily people that want to be writers, but people that want to be artists come to me too, because they often confuse the fact that I've written for comics with the fact that I have somehow have this, pipeline to getting them a job as a comic book artist. When I have to explain to them, no, it's different. But what I was thinking too is that what a lot of people that talk to me about writing, they come up and they say, well, what do I do? And you give them some general things, but then they'll come back and ask you the same question, and they'll come back and ask you the same question. The thing is that people don't really know how to survive as writers and artists, and it's what makes the difference. And it's a long way to get to a question I'm going to get to.
Okay.
But the thing that I've noticed is a lot of the people, they quit before they get started, and they've got the internet now. They go, well, who's buying this stuff? Look it up. Look it up.
Get
I didn't even
Amazon.
have a place to look it up. I went out and found Writer's Digest. I went out and bought books off the stands. So you get tired of people just wanting it handed to them. Now, the reason I say this is because I know, like me, you and I have gone through a lot of different things to survive. And the thing is that we have survived. And there's some people that have not, some that should have. And I know that for a while you went into self-publishing. Is that what led to self-publishing, or is it just the way, just not wanting to deal with the man?
No, I always had this fantasy of doing it. I've recently found things that I did in college where I was working as a I spent a summer working as a carpet salesman at Montgomery Ward, and my friends would come in and they would say, man, are you high? And I didn't do drugs. I just didn't do drugs. And I'd say, no. And they said, man, you look like you're high. And I realized that I was so depressed that I looked like I was stoned to these people. And so I would on my breaks, I'd go to the restroom and I would get into one of the stalls, not to do what you normally do in there. I would get in there to write. And I found these notebooks where I was planning out these big time comics publications that I was someday going to publish, notes about what I would do and how I would set it up and what kind of stories there would be and all this. And so there was just always that drive to kind of to go out on my own and do it. But I think another thing that led to that, and to kind of spin off into that, how did you get jobs? I had this wonderful instructor at the Kubert School, John Belfie, who'd been around the industry for years. He'd worked for Will Eisner and all these different people. But he was working as an advertiser at the time. Now, he taught me this very simple trick, and it's what gave me my career, was that he said, whenever you turn in a job, take in an idea also. Is basically make your own work. And so don't just turn the job in, have another idea for him that will lead to you doing something else. And that really paid off for me, because the editors could see that I was on the ball, that I was thinking that I was actually I was a factory,
Yeah.
And so they learned to depend on me. Also, I met my deadlines, which is...
That's very important.
Oh, the editors I've seen guys that could draw circles around me and just do phenomenal work, but editors couldn't. They make editors' lives hell by not turning in work on time, and everyone suffers. And until last year, I'd never missed a ship date, and I'd never missed a deadline. I had surgery last year, and I was out of commission for 3 months. But yeah, slacking. I was slacking.
He got
I felt like
he got this pretty face through plastic surgery.
yeah, sorry. But but even then, the 2 days after I got home from the hospital, I was back at the drawing board as long as I could stand it. And so perfect. But
Yeah.
this deadlines are important.